All right. Good morning. So, Odessa Wesleyan Church, this is our journey through the Bible for August the 16th, 2026. And I want to start off this morning reading from Mark chapter 4, starting at verse 35. So, Mark 4:35. That day when evening came, he said, and this is talking about Jesus, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There was also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. Jesus said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." So think about it for a couple seconds here. This scripture I just read. After seeing all that Jesus had done, hearing all of his teachings that he taught, isn't it amazing that when a crisis hit, those closest to him, his disciples, they were overwhelmed with fear. They didn't go to Jesus and say, "Jesus, wake up, calm this storm." They went to Jesus and said, "We're all going to die. Aren't you, concerned about that?" Now, to their credit, they did turn to Jesus, but they almost were, like trying to make him aware of the crisis, not the solution to the crisis. And then when Jesus calmed the storm, that some translators translate the word as amaze, but this translation I just read to you, they were terrified, which again amazes my mind because they've seen the miracles they've done, and all of a sudden, to me, if you have power over illness and you can turn water into wine and all the miracles that he had done, and then they're surprised that he has authority over nature as well. And I think maybe this is coming from their culture, not that unfortunately culture sometimes negatively influences us, our relationship with God, because in the Greek and the Roman mindset that there's different gods that control different things. Yes, there's one mighty God over all of them, but he kind of just sits there and watches the rest of them play around. So the disciples, saw Jesus' power, believed he was God. To me, that would be the next step. Well, we're in the middle of a storm that, looks like it's about to kill us. Why not go to Jesus, the Son of God, who's right there with us, and have him calm the storm? We need to understand that Jesus proved that he was the Messiah, that he was God, and he didn't need to overly proclaim it. Listening to his words and seeing his actions were proof enough. Now, what we need to keep in mind as we look back 2,000 years ago and we look at the disciples' actions that night during that storm, that we're no different sometimes. Sometimes, no longer how long we've had a relationship with God, we allow doubt and lack of faith to interfere in our relationship with him. And maybe if we don't see it in our own lives, we need to remember in other people's lives as well that sometimes we allow things to interfere in our relationship with God. And instead of being judgmental, we need to have some grace. One, give ourselves some grace, which is very hard to do sometimes. And other times, give other people grace in their struggles with God. But at the same time, point them to trusting in God. So Jesus poses some miracles, some power, actions of power here, God's power. And right after this event, the waves calm, they come up to the shore, they get off the boat, And immediately, Luke tells us what immediately happens in Luke chapter 8. So they sailed to the region of Gergenesis, which is across the lake from Galilee. When Jesus stepped ashore, he was met by a demon-possessed man from town. For a long time, this man had not worn clothes or lived in a house, but lived in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell at his feet, shouting at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, don't torture me." For Jesus had commanded the impure spirit to come out of the man. Many times it seized him, and though he was chained hand and foot and kept under guard, he had broken his chains and been driven by the demon into solitary places. Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "Legion," he replied, because many demons had gone into him. And they begged Jesus repeatedly not to order them into the abyss. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the hillside. The demons begged Jesus to let them go into the pigs. He gave them permission. When the demons came out of the man, they went to the pigs, and the herd rushed down a steep bank into the lake and was drowned. When those tending the pigs saw what happened, they ran off and reported this to the town and the countryside. And the people went out to see what happened. When they came to Jesus, they found the man whom the demons had gone out of, sitting at Jesus' feet, dressed in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people how the demon-possessed man had been cured. Then all the people of the region asked Jesus to leave them because they were overcome with fear. So he got into the boat and left. The man from whom the demons had gone out begged to go with him, but Jesus sent him away, saying, "Return home and tell how much God has done for you." So the man went away and told all over the town how much Jesus had done for him. So this area that Jesus landed in on the shore was called the Decapolis. And literally that means in Greek, 10 cities. This was an area settled by the Greeks after Alexander the Great's conquest of this area in the 4th century BC. It's very much the Hellenistic culture, which we've talked about in the past, which means very much steeped into the Greek way of thinking of logic and philosophy, also the Greek religion and the Greek language. These people, were probably the closest you could find to those living in Athens at the time that were living in this region of the Middle East. And so Jesus goes, they were the Gentiles. They were the people that, the Jews avoided, and this demon-possessed man was driven away due to his actions. He didn't fit into cultured society. He was a disruption. And he was left to himself to live in a cemetery, avoided and outcast. So, first of all, I think the disciples were thinking, even after the storm, because again, the storm didn't just push them over to the side of the lake. Jesus said before they got into the boat, remember in Mark, let's go to the other side. First of all, the disciples were like, well, we want to go over there to those Greeks. Those guys are, they worship all these gods and, they have a different culture and they look down on us. And then I think, the disciples, they get there and they see this guy, naked and dirty and screaming and yelling and, just acting awful. And they're like, probably in their head saying, see, I told you we shouldn't come here. And then what else do they see? Up on the hillside are these herders. And what are they herding? Pigs. Pigs. You don't go near pigs as a good Jewish person. So the disciples probably in their mindsets like, what is Jesus doing here? There are plenty of Jewish people around us that need to hear, need to see your power. Why are we here? But Jesus shows through his actions, and he wanted the disciples to understand, and it took them a while to understand this, that God is there for everyone. And that is something totally, I think, shocking because, in the Jewish mindset, the Messiah was there to put things right as far as the Jewish outset, that Jesus was there for everyone. It didn't matter, Jew or Gentile. So as Jesus does this great miracle, drives these demons out of this guy, and he comes to himself, and he's sitting there listening to Jesus teach, and all of a sudden, crowds start appearing. Now, these people, do they sit down and, listen to him? No, they push Jesus out. They say, go away, because, they recognize that he's not a human embodiment of their gods. So that makes them uncomfortable. That this guy who, is hanging around a bunch of Jewish people, and he brought some other friends with him, and he's over here in an area where they don't show up, and all of a sudden he's showing power. I think in their own mindset, that challenges their culture, that challenges their history, that challenges what they're comfortable with. And they didn't want that. Instead of taking a step back and saying, maybe my religion's wrong. Maybe my view of spirituality is wrong. Maybe my gods aren't really true after all. Instead, what do? They want to stay with what's comfortable. So what's my point here? That as we're talking to people about the relationship that God wants to have with them, that sometimes what's the word I want to use here? The blocks we come up against, the anger we come up against, the rejection we come up against, it's not against us. So don't take it personal. That's easier said than done. I understand that. But secondly, realize that this life-changing relationship with God, life change is not something we really want. We like our culture. We like our safety. It's very much, even if we're in the worst possible situation, which without a relationship with God we are, that sometimes that's what's comfortable to us. That's what's safe. That's what's familiar. And sometimes we reject God because we don't want change. But we need to. Now, let's apply that to those of us who have a relationship with God. But sometimes when God is doing things in your life and you read something in the scripture and you go, oh, that doesn't make me comfortable. So you flip a few pages to something a little bit more comfortable. God's speaking to you. And again, that this life change, this relationship with God isn't a one-time thing that happens, 1 hour of your life and you can go on and you've got your ticket to heaven and you're good. That the longer you serve God and the longer you open up your life, the more he changes you, the more he puts your spiritual life in order. And at the end of your life, when you'll reach heaven, you'll look back and not recognize your pre-relationship self if you live that life that God wants you to live. And so you need to keep that in mind, that as we're reading the Bible, sometimes it's easy to say, well, the Messiah is there. Well, they rejected God, they rejected Jesus, so let's just turn our backs on him. And this happened. Peter, a few years later, was confronted by God about reaching out to the Gentiles. That Peter, the leader of the early church, this way, all of a sudden God appears to him in the book of Acts and says, hey, don't call anything clean or unclean. He was talking about human beings. That Peter was going to the Jewish people and ministering them. That he forgot that day on the shore. He forgot the power of God was displayed to the Gentiles. That there was a big controversy, in the early church as Paul's missionary endeavors. He was going to the Gentiles, and he would first go find a group of Jewish people, whether it was the synagogue or a group of people that were worshiping. He would go talk to them, and a lot of times they said, no, we don't want this, words that you're speaking. So he would go to the Gentiles and all of a sudden see this great, bloom of spiritual growth among them. And then there was questions saying, well, why are you going to all these pagans, all these sinners? Well, because God called me to. And there was a debate within the early church. And finally it came down to, God was sent for everyone. He wasn't just sent to make us good Jewish people. He was sent to have a relationship with us. And so it's easy sometimes, we like being closed in our Christian culture, and we like, being around each other and doing all those acts and all that stuff, which is good. That's part of our life. But at the same time, Jesus didn't die for Christians. Jesus died to make people Christian. And so how do we do this? We need to be in places where they're worshiping gods we don't really understand, we don't really like, that they don't really understand or like our lifestyle either. That's where we need to be. Because if it's changed our life so much that, if we have experienced spiritual healing, then at the same time, we need to be with people that need spiritual healing as well. And sometimes people will say, hey, I don't want to hear your words. Jesus experienced that. The disciples experienced that. All throughout the church experienced that. Does that mean we, close ourselves in and lock our doors on, Sunday morning? No. It means we still need to reach out to them, no matter what. How did Jesus do this? He looked at the demon-possessed man who said, Jesus, you've done so much for me. I want to stay in your presence. Sometimes we experience that in church. We just don't want to leave the worship service, or we don't want to leave our personal devotions. But what does Jesus do to this man? Go back and tell others. Go back and spread the word. He was successful. Again, we don't know his name. But again, as the disciples, as the early Christians started reaching out to these Gentile areas, they have heard about Jesus. They've, so different people, different Gentiles that have encountered Jesus, they laid a foundation. So when Christian missionaries came into their area, there was ready for a spiritual crop to harvest. So Jesus returns back to his hometown, gets back on the boat, sails back to his hometown. And as he's there teaching, a leader of the synagogue comes up to him and says, my little girl's dying. She's so sick, she's going to die. This is in Mark chapter 5. And Jesus says, he goes, you could heal him, Jesus, so come and heal him. And Jesus says, okay, so wherever they were, it had to be a little bit of a walk. And there's crowds around him. All of a sudden, Jesus gets up and leaves. The crowds are like, oh, he's going someplace. Well, let's follow him. So all this crowd, because I believe that Jesus didn't, just kind of walk along in silence or whatever. I think he took every opportunity. So I almost imagine, I don't know if I want to challenge Pastor Tammy to do this, because knowing her, she challenged me to do it instead, to walk around and preach. Okay, this Sunday, we're going to stand up. We're going to go up and down Main Street of Odessa, and we're going to have church, and I'm going to preach a sermon. What? But I think Jesus probably was still teaching. He was probably still talking, and whatever. And so as he's going to heal, all of a sudden this woman comes up behind him and just touches him. And Jesus stops. And what does the whole crowd do? You imagine, everybody stops. And Jesus looks around and says, who touched me? Now his disciples are like, what? Jairus here, this leader of the synagogue, whose daughter's dying, it's like, why is he stopping? Let's go. What do you mean, people? There's a whole crowd. There's hundreds, maybe thousands of people crowded around you. Well, this woman had an affliction that she, had bled constantly her whole life. And because of that, under Levitical law, she was deemed unclean until her bleeding stopped. Well, her bleeding never stopped. So that meant, one, she couldn't go to the temple. She couldn't go to the synagogue. Number two, she really couldn't participate in any of the Jewish feasts. And anybody who encountered her was deemed unclean as well. So basically, she was an outcast. It wasn't because she rejected God. It was just because she had a physical ailment. How many times do we, see this, we see people, not wanting to be, they believe in God, they want to have a relationship with God, but they have something. And instead of us saying that doesn't matter, that doesn't matter, you still need God, you still need to be with us, they pull themselves away. They pull themselves away. It could be something emotional, it could be something, social, relational. It can be, something spiritual. But as Christians, Jesus destroyed that whole unclean, clean issue and said, that's where the unclean people need to be, is seeking me, not pushed away from society, not closed off. So finally, this woman in fear came up to Jesus and said, I was ill, I touched you, and immediately you healed me. Does Jesus say to her, how dare you? You don't have right to steal the power of God, that you should just ask me, or, now that you touched me, you made me unclean too. He doesn't condemn her. Instead, he looks at her and says, your faith made you healed. Your faith made you healed. And so this woman, her life was changed. So then what happens? Somebody comes up to Jairus, his father, and says, don't bother Jesus anymore. Your daughter just died. And you imagine that. You imagine that, sometimes, we have done that for loved ones. We've sought God's power of healing. We've sought God's grace. And for whatever reason, that hasn't happened. Now, for the Christian, death is healing. And I will, as I minister to people who are dying or Christians, I remind them, I know right now on earth, this is not comfortable. This is painful. And I know your family's suffering, grief, but you need to understand that God says he will heal you, whether it's here on earth or in heaven. In our heart of hearts, let's admit we want to be healed here on earth, for ourselves, for our family. But, so what does Jesus, do? Maybe Jairus, was about to say, okay, Jesus, thanks for the effort. I got to go arrange my funeral rites for my daughter. Jesus looks at him and says, have faith. Your daughter isn't dead. Well, think about that. The man left his home. He's the leader of a synagogue. And again, remember what happened at the synagogue a little while before when Jesus started his ministry? He was thrown out, dragged to a cliff, about to throw over a cliff. Now, all of a sudden, the leader of the synagogue is coming to beg him to heal his daughter. So Jesus' ministry, his words, his actions have had a great impact on the area. So they continue along. Now, in the Jewish tradition, that you had to be buried before sundown of the day that you died. They didn't have embalming. They didn't have what we had, in this modern day. So, and then the whole community would show up at the deceased house. And there was actually people, widows, actually, who would, mourn and weep and cry and sing songs of grief. And so as you show up, there's this loud procession and probably upstairs in the bedroom, this girl is getting prepared for burial. Remember, the women that went to Jesus' tomb, that's what their whole purpose was, to put spices and do the rituals on Jesus' body on that Sunday morning. Well, fortunately for them, guess what? They didn't have to do that. And so these people probably were preparing, to do that and waiting for Jairus to hurry back so they could bury his child. And Jesus walks and looks at all this, chaos and all this stuff. And probably the grandmother's cooking the funeral meals and everything else, and says, she's not dead. Well, we wouldn't have sent news to a grieving father whose child's dying that she died if she wasn't dead. And they're like, yeah, okay, who are you? So Jesus goes upstairs where, the body of this girl is. And, he takes the mother, the father, and his disciples. And he goes over to her and simply says, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." And all of a sudden she opens her eyes, takes a deep breath, and stands up. The father had news from witnesses saying his daughter had died. The mother, being a good mother, I'm sure was there for this girl's last breath hours before. Again, we don't know how long, this took. The disciples heard. The disciples saw the mourners outside. And all of a sudden, this girl's alive. And Jesus says, "Give her something to eat." Now, this phrase that he uses is an Aramaic phrase. And there has been studies saying, well, why was that put in? Why was that? Again, that this is coming from, firsthand accounts. So why was that so important? Why did the gospel writer think that they needed to note that Jesus spoke in Aramaic? He's in a Jewish household. Why would he speak in Hebrew? Why wouldn't he speak in Greek, the common language? The reason a lot of biblical commentators believe this is because Aramaic is the everyday language. That's the language you use in the marketplace. That's the language, because if you look again, remember, let's go all the way back, that you had people groups before the Israelites showed up that had different language. Then you had the Israelites, Israel and Judah, who spoke Hebrew, but also had interactions with all these people groups. Then you had the Assyrians, then you had the Greeks, then you had the Romans, and the common root of all these languages that eventually, and this was due to, even though Alexander the Great, who had controlled majority of the world at the time, spoke in Greek, they adopted Aramaic because the majority of the conquered people spoke Aramaic. And so the Romans, and some of their intelligence to keep the world together instead of trying to change millions upon millions of people, everyday language was Aramaic. Language for the government was Latin. The high, educated spoke Greek. And then you had these little groups of Jewish people who spoke Hebrew. Jesus used the common everyday words. Again, pointing that he wasn't just the Jewish Messiah. And also, commentators have put out that there was actually Hebrew rituals and rites that you would use to try, to heal somebody. That I think, Jesus used that to show that, it's not in some type of, doing things certain ways. It's in the power of God that great things happen. So what's to learn, from these three accounts of healing? One, we need to remember Jesus is the one that has power over all things to heal us spiritually, emotionally, physically, mentally, socially. That when healing needs to happen, and all of us need healing, Jesus is the source of that power. So if we need to want to be healed, that we need to believe that he can and heal us. That demon-possessed guy could have said, "No, Jesus, I like these demons. Go away." And yes, Jesus could have driven them out, but those demons would come right back. That the demon-possessed man had to be willing to be healed spiritually. The woman healed of her bleeding. It says here, for 12 years, she suffered under many doctors, many cures that weren't cures at all. She could have given up hope. She could have said, well, Jesus just walked by. If he really cared about me, he would have, said, hey, you're healed, and kept on going. Instead, she approached Jesus for a source of healing. that after 12 years of everything that she had went through, she still had enough faith that if I just come close to Jesus and touch the hem of his garment, I'll be healed. That's the third point. You need to go, not just be willing to believe, but you need to come to the presence of God. You can't just kind of sit back and go, well, hopefully God heals me. We need to go. Whatever that in our life needs healing, we need to go there. And we need to place our hope, our trust, our faith in his power to heal. What does he say there to Jairus? Have faith. Have faith, your daughter's only sleeping. That's a challenging thing for Jesus to say, and a challenging thing for Jairus to accept. And especially the closer he gets home, because again, I'm not talking this wailing and weeping and this mourning is kind of limited. You can hear it forever because, these people in this time period, you will still see this in the Mideast. There's professional mourners, and that's what they do. They mourn on behalf of the people. And the louder they are, the reason is to let other people know, hey, now we put a notice in the paper. We put, email or text out, say, hey, funeral's going to be this day and whatever. That the whole community is drawn in, to this mourning process. And so the closer they probably get to Jairus' home, the more you're hearing this. He walks up, sees the grief on his wife's face. He walks up and sees his daughter's not taking a breath. She looks dead to him. But the whole point, Jesus said, just have faith. Again, this goes back to a couple weeks ago. We talked when Jesus talked about in that parable, that little mustard seed of faith. That if you have just a little bit of faith in God and what he can do, he will surprise you more than you're asked, more than you expect. So Mark chapter 6, after all this has happened, again, this has been a word spread because I'm pretty sure that there was probably some people from the other side of the lake that hopped on boats that followed this Jesus who has power over these demons. There's people who, heard this miracle from this woman that, of healing. There's people who see a 12-year-old girl walking around that was dead. And Jesus shows up in his hometown. When the Sabbath came, Mark chapter 6, verse 2, when the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue. And many who heard him were amazed. Where did this man get these things? They asked. What is this wisdom has been given to him? What are these remarkable miracles he's performing? Now, to us, we would think surely this is the Messiah. Verse 3. Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown, among his relatives and in this home. He could not do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. He was amazed at their lack of faith. So after all that Jesus did and said, those who knew him the best and the longest lacked faith and belief in him. But before we judge them, with all that we have here in the 21st century, spiritually, all that we have learned, all that we have available to us in regard to Jesus, do we too lack faith and belief in him sometimes? Do we go, no, God's not going to do this. God can't do this. First of all, drop the God can't. Do we fail sometimes to believe in him? Do we fail to trust him? So today is a little bit more on those, first of all, those of you who are listening that haven't come to this point to accept this relationship with God. You can't deny that it's not available to you. But all you have to do is allow him to have that relationship with you. He has it available. It's no different than a person you haven't ate for weeks and weeks and weeks, and somebody sits down and fixes you and me and puts it in front of you to solve your hunger right there. And you get up and you walk away from the table and go, boy, I really wish I wasn't hungry anymore. Spiritually, that's how a lot of people are. The spiritual banquet, the spiritual blessing is there for you. Amen. It's laid out there for you. God's not going to force feed you. God's going to lay it there, but you have to pick up in faith and accept that relationship. For those of us who are believers, sometimes culturally we create this thing called cultural Christianity, and we get stuck in our own little boxes where it's comfortable. And that's natural human being. But sometimes I wonder if Jesus appeared like he did there, dressed as an everyday workman, and walked up behind our pulpit and started teaching, would we go, this guy didn't go to seminary. This guy doesn't have a Bible school certificate. You know, this guy was a carpenter. He built my back steps last week. Who is he to tell me how to live my life? That be very careful about being so comfortable in your Christianity that you don't forget there's many, many out there who need God and who need us to bring him to him. So, who is Jesus? This question's been debated from the time Jesus walked on earth to today. And it boils down to this. Either Jesus is God or he isn't. There's no shading, coloring, taking away, adding anything. It boils down to really the choice everybody has to make. Either I accept that he's God or I reject it. Looking at all the evidence he offered, these prophecies that we've talked about that he fulfilled, the events of his birth, John the Baptist's testimony about him, Jesus' own teaching, the authority that he had, the power he displayed, he is truly God. So the real question for each of us we must answer is not who Jesus is or who Jesus isn't, but will I believe it or not believe it? That's what really boils down to it. Either we reject the truth about Jesus or we accept the truth about Jesus. God wants you to accept that truth. Truth doesn't change even if our opinions are different. God's truth, Jesus is God. He was God. He is God and will always be God. And he wants a relationship with you. You've got to come to a point to either accept it or reject it. If you want to know how to accept it, contact us. We will show you how easy it is. So for next week, we're going to continue to look at Matthew 9 through 11. Oh, I didn't write that down. I forgot. Matthew 9 through 11. Mark 6, and John 4 through 5. John 4 through 5. All right, let's close in prayer. Lord, thank you that you made it so obvious that you wanted a relationship with us, that you came to this earth and you brought that relationship to us. That we don't have to go through steps. We don't have to make ourselves good enough. That you presented your truth and you said, just simply accept that relationship with me. Lord, no matter how long we've had this relationship, renew our faith, our hope, our trust, our belief in your power and your words so that it affects the lives around us to bring them to your relationship. And for those of us who are teetering, who are like, I don't really know about Jesus, I don't really know, help us understand it's either yes or no. There's no gray area. There's no, well, some of this I believe, some of this I don't. Help us to take that step, to allow that relationship with you totally 100% in our life. In your name, amen. All right. Well, you have a good week this week, folks, and join us in a little bit for our worship service today.